Carl Jung discovered that certain people see reality in ways most never will. These individuals perceive hidden patterns, unconscious motives, and psychological truths invisible to others. Jung called this ability dangerous because those who possess it often end up isolated, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal relationships. Not because they're broken, but because seeing everything comes with a cost no one understands. Today, I'll show you what spiritually awake people perceive that remains hidden to the collective unconscious, why this perception threatens social stability, and how Jung believed you could transform this curse into extraordinary power. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so dangerous. Jung's clinical practice revealed patients with what he termed differentiated perception. These people could read micro-expressions instantly, sense hidden emotions before they surfaced, and detect psychological patterns everyone else missed completely. They saw through social masks like glass, identified lies without effort, and felt unconscious tensions in every room they entered. Jung documented how these individuals consistently ended up isolated and unable to maintain normal relationships, not from instability, but because their perception had become too refined for social survival. He realized he wasn't treating mental illness. He was observing what happens when unconscious content becomes too conscious, when perception differentiates beyond what collective life can tolerate. Jung called this discovery dangerous because these people possessed a gift that destroyed them from the inside out. The case that changed everything involved a patient Jung treated in 1913 during his own crisis after breaking from Freud. This patient represented the rarest personality type Jung would identify. She possessed undifferentiated intuitive perception. Walking into any room, she immediately sensed the complete psychological atmosphere. Who was lying? Who carried emotional pain? Who harbored secret resentments? All of it became instantly visible to her. Jung wrote that this patient displayed extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, but this faculty caused her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't engage in casual conversation because she saw through every social facade. She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around her. She couldn't hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective, unconscious agreements keeping groups functional. Jung realized something profound. This wasn't pathology. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. He documented her describing people with startling accuracy. She spoke of others as if accessing their private thoughts and hidden motivations. When Jung verified her observations through careful questioning, they proved remarkably accurate. This wasn't delusion or psychosis. This was consciousness so refined it threatened the social order itself. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about what these people actually perceive. Jung began investigating what he later termed participation mystique, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious contents from others. He wrote in his Red Book period notes that certain people possess psychic apparatus so finely tuned they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment. Modern research validates Jung's observations. Dr. Elaine Aron's work on highly sensitive persons shows roughly 20% of people have heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something more specific: the introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population, doesn't just feel deeply. They perceive unconscious patterns with startling clarity that others cannot detect. Jung observed these individuals have differentiated intuitive function. Their brains process not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content, and psychological patterns invisible to others. They see depression behind forced smiles. They sense desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore completely. Jung wrote that danger lies not in perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. When you see clearly what others cannot or will not see, you become a mirror society cannot bear to look into. This creates what Jung called the problem of the superior function. Your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden because it separates you from collective unconscious participation completely. The real danger wasn't just the perception itself, though. People with highly differentiated perception see others' unconscious contents clearly, making them targets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection. When someone's shadow reflects back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind faces two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror showing it. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly throughout his clinical work. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating problems they're merely observing. His patients with differentiated intuition experienced this constantly in their lives. When they gently suggested someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or creating drama. When they expressed concern about obvious problems, they got accused of being judgmental or manufacturing issues where none existed. Jung realized this wasn't coincidence. This was psychological defense operating automatically. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote that everything irritating us about others can lead us to understanding ourselves. But for most people, attacking the person, reflecting their shadow, feels easier than examining what gets reflected back. This creates what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems already existing in the collective unconscious that nobody wants to acknowledge. Jung observed that the bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. This pattern explains why these individuals don't just feel misunderstood. They feel systematically targeted by forces they cannot rationally explain or escape from. Jung's most disturbing discovery came from observing how overwhelming perception manifested differently across individuals. He identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing different ways of processing unconscious contents from others around them. Type 1 combines introverted intuition with differentiated feeling function. Jung documented patients who don't just see what's happening psychologically, they feel it completely in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so thoroughly, they often cannot distinguish between their own feelings and those unconsciously absorbed from their environment. Jung wrote that the feeling intuitive lives in perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment constantly. Type 2 combines thinking with intuition. These individuals see psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. Jung observed they could forecast relationship failures, career disasters, and personal breakdowns months before occurrence, not through logical analysis, but through unconscious pattern recognition operating beyond conscious awareness. Jung noted they possess uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes others cannot yet see unfolding. Type 3 combines sensation with intuition. Jung documented patients who could sense physical manifestations of psychological states in others before symptoms appeared, detecting illness before acknowledgement, sensing fatigue before admission, feeling bodily tension indicating emotional distress. Jung wrote these individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical disease in their environment constantly. Type 4 represents the rarest type Jung encountered. Pure intuitives combine introverted intuition with undifferentiated auxiliary function. They see everything but have difficulty organizing or expressing perceptions coherently to others. Jung observed they live in perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively or usefully. Understanding your specific pattern proves crucial because each type requires different approaches to what Jung called the integration challenge ahead. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered superior perception genuinely dangerous. Jung observed devastating effects of undifferentiated perception on his patients over years. He concluded that seeing everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine dangers to both individual and collective well-being simultaneously. Jung identified 3 specific dangers, making this discovery so threatening to stability. Danger 1 involves collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote that individuals who perceive too clearly threaten collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends fundamentally. When someone sees through shared illusions holding groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become destabilizing forces. Jung observed that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged publicly. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically among others. Danger 2 creates psychological isolation. Jung documented how differentiated perception creates the problem of superior function, when your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering consistently. He wrote that the curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it naturally. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness surrounding them. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. These individuals often report feeling like they're living in completely different reality from everyone around them constantly. Danger 3 risks identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found people who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality completely. They become so flooded with external psychological material, they cannot distinguish between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment constantly. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious content surrounding them. He wrote that danger is not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession entirely. This is why Jung considered integration of superior perception not just therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent for survival. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents emerging constantly. Phase 1 involves recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't their own originally. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content from others. Jung wrote that the first task is establishing what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development possible. The technique Jung instructed was spending time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice emerging clearly. Phase 2 requires shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own shadows first. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you become, seeing these qualities in others around you. Jung wrote that everything irritating us about others can lead to understanding ourselves, but only if we have courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward constantly. Shadow integration means acknowledging you contain every human quality you observe in others around you. This doesn't make you bad, it makes you complete. Someone who can see clearly without judgment, coloring perception. Phase 3 involves conscious participation. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity in the process. Jung wrote that the individuated person can serve as bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity in service. This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own contents. Jung understood that superior perception either destroys or transforms individuals completely. He studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown patterns. The case of Nietzsche shows unintegrated perception. Jung was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy, but observed how superior perception ultimately led to psychological collapse. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote about Nietzsche's ability to see through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity nobody matched. However, Jung noted, Nietzsche never learned to integrate these insights constructively into life. Instead of using perception in service of healing, he wielded it as weapon against society viciously. Jung wrote that Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into balanced personality structure. Jung observed that Nietzsche's isolation and eventual breakdown represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see rather than transformed by it constructively. The case of Meister Eckhart shows successful integration. Jung extensively studied the medieval mystic, whom he considered an example of successfully integrated superior perception. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities others could not access directly. Unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled insights into compassionate service for others. Jung wrote that Eckhart transformed superior perception into wisdom that could nourish others without overwhelming them unnecessarily. He saw clearly, but spoke in ways inviting understanding rather than resistance from listeners. Jung noted Eckhart's success came from conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is gift to be shared wisely, not weapon to be wielded against others destructively. Jung's own integration journey proved most significant. Jung documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919, recorded in the Red Book carefully. Jung wrote he was menaced by psychosis and saved only by ability to understand what was happening through work with patients experiencing similar states. His superior perception of unconscious contents, both his own and others, nearly destroyed him until he learned integrating these experiences consciously through dedicated work. Jung's breakthrough came when he realized overwhelming perceptions weren't pathological but evolutionary. They represented consciousness, attempting to evolve beyond current collective limitations, restricting human development. This realization transformed his approach to patients with similar gifts completely. Because individuals with superior perception often face isolation, Jung emphasized crucial importance of finding what he called the few who understand, others capable of engaging with differentiated consciousness without defensiveness or fear. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized in isolation. It requires witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity when present. Jung identified three essential types of relationships for highly perceptive individuals seeking integration. Type 1 involves fellow individuated persons. Jung wrote that individuated persons recognize each other immediately. There is quality of presence, authenticity, that cannot be fabricated convincingly. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious minority operating differently. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With fellow individuated persons, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them unnecessarily. Type 2 involves those engaged in individuation. Jung observed that people actively engaged in their own individuation process through therapy, inner work, or spiritual practice can often handle superior perception without defensiveness emerging. They may not possess it themselves, but they understand its value profoundly. Jung wrote that those who have begun knowing themselves can bear being known by others, without collapsing defensively. Type 3 involves natural containers. Jung identified individuals who, while not possessing superior perception themselves, have what he called natural container function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it consistently. These might be mature individuals who have weathered significant life challenges successfully. The recognition process Jung developed helps identify safe relationships carefully. They ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending against them. They can acknowledge their own contradictions and limitations without shame emerging. They demonstrate what Jung called psychological mindedness, interest in inner reality over external appearances. They maintain emotional stability when confronted with uncomfortable truths directly. They show genuine curiosity about consciousness and growth possibilities. Jung emphasized the goal is not finding people who accept everything you see. The goal is finding people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions to understanding rather than threats to their self-image. Because integrated superior perception serves both individual and collective development, Jung viewed successful individuation as essential not just for personal well-being, but for evolution of human consciousness itself. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self that the individual has always been carrier of living spirit, the one who brings about change in society. He believed individuals who successfully integrate superior perception become what he called culture carriers, people who help consciousness evolve forward. The 4 stages of transformation follow patterns Jung observed repeatedly. Stage 1 involves recognition without overwhelm. The first transformation occurs when you learn acknowledging your perceptive abilities without being crushed by them. Jung called this conscious acceptance of the superior function. Jung wrote that the beginning of wisdom is recognition of what one actually is, not what one wishes to be or fears to be. Stage 2 involves integration without isolation. The second stage involves learning to use perception constructively while maintaining meaningful relationships. Jung called this social individuation, becoming authentically yourself while remaining connected to others. Jung observed that individuated person does not withdraw from world, but engages with it more consciously than before. Stage 3 involves service without sacrifice. The third transformation happens when perception becomes gift you offer, rather than burden you carry. Jung called this conscious participation, using abilities in service of others without depleting yourself. Jung wrote that privilege of lifetime is becoming who you truly are, then offering that authentic self in service of the whole. Stage 4 involves legacy without attachment. The final stage involves what Jung called transcendent function, using perception to contribute to collective consciousness evolution without attachment to whether others recognize or accept your contributions. Jung observed that individuated person works for future, not for personal recognition in present moment. The integration becomes cultural medicine when Jung believed individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve vital evolutionary function. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps forward. Jung wrote that what is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help make unconscious contents conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior patterns. Your superior perception isn't malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you see everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of your time in evolution. The question isn't whether you should suppress perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. Jung's individuation method offers path from dangerous isolation to conscious service, from overwhelming perception to integrated wisdom, from psychological curse to evolutionary contribution. You were born to see everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with integration, wisdom, and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Your gift is not your burden. Your unconscious relationship to your gift is your burden. Learn to integrate it consciously, and you become exactly what Jung believed highly perceptive individuals were meant to be. Consciousness pioneers, preparing humanity for psychological development that is inevitable but not yet obvious. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't that some people see everything. It's that most people who see everything never learn to use what they see wisely. The danger isn't in perception itself, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Once you learn wielding perception as consciously as Jung learned wielding his. The danger of seeing everything isn't that you see too much. It's that you might never learn to see with integration and wisdom your gifts demand. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of the highly perceptive individual, you're part of rare psychological type Jung believed essential for consciousness evolution. Share in the comments which type of differentiated perceiver you are. Your individuation journey connects with others walking the same path. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's discoveries about psychological development that transcends collective unconscious limitations. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.